He slid the photograph across the table with two fingers, the way a man slides a playing card he knows will end the game. Seraphine looked down at it. 3 men. 3 of the people she had spent 15 years keeping invisible. 3 bodies, arranged the way only one organization in the world arranges bodies. Arms crossed, a single silver coin placed over each closed eye. She didn't move, didn't reach for her wine, didn't look at her husband, who sat watching her from across the candlelight with eyes that had gone very still. "Someone sent it to my private line," Dorian said, "the one that doesn't exist." She turned the photograph face down. "Then we have a problem," she said. "If you've ever loved someone and kept a secret that could destroy them, drop your city in the comments. And if this story grabs you from the first minute, hit like and subscribe. I need to know how far this is traveling. Don't stop watching. What comes next will change everything you think you understand about who really holds the power." The night the Viscari Empire began to crack started not with gunfire, but with a phone call Dorian never received. It was routed through a number that technically didn't belong to any network registered in the United States, bounced through a relay in Reykjavik, and then again through a server cluster in Montevideo, and it terminated in a burner unit taped beneath the third drawer of a mahogany dresser in the east bedroom of the Viscari estate. A dresser that was technically Seraphine's, but that Dorian had never once opened. The call lasted 11 seconds. She was in the kitchen when it came through. She heard the single pre-programmed vibration pattern through the floor, the way you feel a train approaching before you hear it. She set down the coffee she was making for the housekeeper, excused herself with a small smile, walked upstairs, retrieved the phone, listened, said nothing, and then stood alone in the bedroom for a long moment looking out the window at the manicured grounds below. The gardener was trimming the yew hedges. The security detail was rotating at the south gate. Everything looked exactly as it always looked on a Tuesday morning in October. She replaced the phone under the drawer. She went back to the kitchen. She finished making the coffee. That was 3 weeks before the first captain died. His name was Carver Munn. He had worked for Dorian for 11 years, starting as a driver, rising to run the port operations that moved the Viscari organization's most sensitive cargo through the container terminals south of Baltimore. He was 43 years old, had a wife and 2 daughters in Annapolis, and kept a mistress in a studio apartment near the Inner Harbor whom everybody in the organization knew about and nobody mentioned. He was not a good man particularly, but he was a dependable one, and in Dorian's world, dependability counted for more than virtue. Munn was found in his car on a Wednesday morning in the parking structure beside the terminal. The engine was still running. The coin on his eye had no markings anybody recognized. Dorian was at his office on the 40th floor of a building he legally owned through 4 corporate intermediaries when the call came. He listened, asked 3 questions, hung up, and then sat without moving for a full minute while his assistant waited outside the glass door pretending to read something on his phone. Then he called his second captain, a man named Toussaint Graves, and told him to lock everything down. He did not call Seraphine. That was a habit he had built carefully over 15 years, not out of cruelty, but out of a conviction so deep and unexamined it had become structural, like a load-bearing wall. His world and her world were different rooms. She moved through charity luncheons and museum boards and the kind of quiet civic presence that kept their name clean. He moved through pressurized darkness. The separation protected her, or so he believed. What he did not know, could not have guessed, was that Seraphine had known about Munn's death 12 hours before he did, and she had spent those 12 hours making calculations. She was at a gallery opening on the evening Dorian got the news. She wore a deep gray dress and spoke for 20 minutes with the city comptroller's wife about a youth arts initiative, and she laughed at the right moments, and she accepted a glass of champagne she did not drink. And behind her eyes, in the place where the real thinking happened, she was moving pieces across a board Dorian had never seen. The second captain died 6 days later. His name was Felix Corraro, and he ran the Viscari financial infrastructure through a web of accounting firms in 4 cities, most of which he managed through intermediaries who had never met him in person. He was methodical and cold, and had an almost clinical disregard for the human cost of what he processed. He died in his home office. The coin was silver. The arms were crossed. The third happened within 48 hours. Her name was Marta Pell, and she was one of only 3 women who had ever held captain rank in the Vescari organization. She ran communications, the encrypted networks, the dead drops, the rotating contact protocols. She had been with the organization since the beginning. Dorian had trusted her with things he hadn't trusted anyone else. 3 captains in 8 days. Dorian stopped sleeping. He called a war council in a room below a restaurant in the garment district, the kind of room with no windows and air that smelled of old concrete. He sat at the head of a table with men who had fought for him, killed for him, bled on his behalf, and he watched their faces while his consigliere listed everything they knew, which was almost nothing. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no witnesses, no pattern in the victim's recent movements that pointed to a shared vulnerability. The port operations hadn't been touched. The financial accounts were intact. The encrypted communications were still running. Whatever this was, it wasn't a takeover. It wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense. It looked, to the men at that table, like a message. To Dorian, alone with his thoughts afterward, it looked like something worse. It looked like someone inside his organization, someone who understood its architecture well enough to move through it unseen, had decided to begin removing specific components. Not randomly. Specifically. He went home that night and found Seraphine reading in the library, a lamp casting warm light across her face, and he stood in the doorway longer than he meant to. She looked up. "You're not sleeping," she said. Not a question. "3 of my captains are dead." "I know." She closed the book. "I heard it on the news. They're calling it organized crime activity. Vague language." He watched her. "Does it mean anything to you?" Something moved behind her eyes. Something quick and carefully contained, like a fish turning in deep water. "Should it?" she said. He didn't answer. He went to pour himself a drink and didn't come back to the library. And Seraphine sat alone for a while with the closed book in her lap and the lamp on her face and the weight of everything she hadn't said pressing against her sternum like a closed fist. The silver coin had a symbol on it, an obsidian circle bisected by a single vertical line. She had seen that symbol twice in her life before this. Once at the age of 12, on the floor of a room she was not supposed to enter. Once at the age of 19, on the wrist of a man who told her she had a destiny she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. She had spent the next 2 decades proving him wrong. What Dorian knew about his wife could fill a detailed file. Princeton educated, fluent in 4 languages, parents deceased before they married, a car accident, she had told him, and she had not elaborated and he had not pushed. A period of her early 20s that was professionally accounted for through consulting work in Europe and Southeast Asia. Volunteer work. A master's in international finance. A reputation in their social world as gracious, composed, and quietly formidable. What he did not know was the rest of it. She had been born Seraphine Morrow, but that name was a construction. Her real family name was one that no longer appeared in any public record anywhere. It had been systematically removed from the databases of 7 countries and 2 private intelligence networks over a period of 3 years by a team she had hired with money she had sequestered at the age of 22 before she walked away from everything. The Obsidian Circle was not a mythology. It was not a whispered legend among underworld figures who'd had too much to drink. It was a functioning criminal architecture that had been operating, largely invisible to law enforcement and rival organizations alike, for nearly 60 years. It had its roots in post-war Europe, had expanded through strategic marriages and financial infiltration through the 60s and 70s, and by the time Seraphine was born, it was less an organization than a bloodline. A network of families bound by oath and interest, and a shared understanding that the only way to be truly safe was to be truly invisible. Her grandfather had built it. Her father had inherited it. Her father had died along with her mother when she was 14 years old in circumstances that were ruled accidental and were not. The man who ruled it now was her father's brother. His name was Aldrich Morrow. She had not spoken to him in 18 years. She had not spoken about him to anyone ever. And when the photograph arrived, the first one, the one she'd burned in the fireplace of the east bedroom while Dorian slept, she had recognized his methodology the same way you recognize a particular smell from childhood, immediately, completely, without being able to fully explain how. He was killing her people, not Dorian's people, hers, Carver Munn had owed his position to a recommendation she had made, quietly and indirectly, 9 years ago, after recognizing in him the specific combination of competence and loyalty she needed in the port operation. Felix Carraro ran financial infrastructure she had designed. Marta Pell had been placed inside the organization before Seraphine had even met Dorian, held in reserve like a long-term investment. Dorian thought he had built an empire. He thought he had recruited these people, developed these systems, constructed these networks. He had not. She had built the empire. She had built it for him, around him, because she loved him, and because she understood that the only way to protect someone from a world they didn't know existed was to control that world completely. She had taken the rough, talented, dangerous man she had fallen in love with and quietly transformed his criminal operation from a neighborhood-level organization into something that rivaled the most sophisticated syndicates in North America. She had done this carefully, over years, through suggestion and quiet maneuvering and the kind of indirect influence that left no fingerprints. He believed he was a king. He was a king. But the throne, the walls, the treasury, the invisible infrastructure beneath everything, those were hers. And now someone was tearing them apart with his eyes open, piece by piece, to make her watch. Toussaint Graves, who had not been targeted, came to the estate on a Thursday. He sat with Dorian in the study for 2 hours. Seraphine brought coffee, set it down, and left without speaking. She stood in the hallway for 30 seconds, listening. Graves was saying that the intelligence network had gone dark in 3 cities simultaneously. Contacts who had been reliable for years had stopped responding. Dead drops had been cleaned out, not by their people. Dorian said someone was inside. Graves agreed. Dorian said he needed the full list of people with access to the infrastructure map. Graves said the infrastructure map was housed on a server to which he personally had never had access. He'd always routed through Marta Pell. There was a silence. "Who built that server?" Dorian said. Graves thought about it. "I assumed you did." Another silence. Longer. Seraphine moved away from the door. In the kitchen, she sat at the island and looked at her hands. They were elegant hands. Steady hands. The kind of hands that didn't shake under pressure, which was a quality she had developed the same way she had developed everything else. Deliberately, through practice. Through the early understanding that emotion was expensive and composure was armor. She was running calculations. Aldrich wanted her to reveal herself. That was the point of the coins, the point of the methodical elimination of her people, not to destroy Dorian's empire, but to force her into a position where the only way to protect what she had built was to step out from behind it. The question was why? Why now, after 18 years? Why not come directly? She thought about the answer for a long time, and when she arrived at it, when the answer assembled itself from pieces she had been carrying for years, she felt the cold move through her the way it had only moved through her twice before. He didn't want her. He wanted what only she could unlock. He was letting Dorian's captains die because he needed Dorian to need her, to finally look at her, to ask the questions she had been waiting 15 years to not answer. Because the moment she was exposed, the moment Dorian knew who she was, what she had built, the circle would have leverage. They would threaten what she loved, and to protect what she loved, she would have to use her access, her authority, the biometric keys she carried that Aldrich couldn't duplicate, to open doors she had spent 18 years keeping closed. She stood up from the kitchen island. She went to the window. The gardener had stopped trimming the yew hedges. The security detail had rotated at the south gate. Everything looked exactly as it always looked. And none of it was what it appeared to be. She thought about the husband she had built an empire for, who was sitting in his study right now believing that the ground beneath him was solid, that the architecture around him was his own creation, that the enemy was someone outside. She thought about how his face would change when he understood. She thought about whether she could protect him without telling him. The answer came back immediately. No. And then the answer beneath that answer came. Not anymore. She was still standing at the window when Dorian walked in, stopped, and looked at her. "My intelligence network is gone," he said. 3/4 of it. Gone. And nobody can tell me who built it. She turned around. "I can," she said. The words came out of her steady and clear, and with the quiet weight of something that had been held back for a very long time. Dorian's face didn't move. His eyes went still the way they went still when he was containing something large. "Then tell me," he said. She held his gaze. "I built it," she said. "All of it. And we need to sit down, because there's more." The word "more" hung in the air between them like smoke. Dorian didn't move. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his jacket still on, the way he always looked when he came home from the kind of meeting that left residue, tight in the shoulders, eyes carrying something he hadn't finished processing. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her exactly once before, years ago, when he'd caught her speaking Mandarin on a phone call she hadn't explained. He had let it go then, filed it somewhere. Men like Dorian were good at filing things they weren't ready to open. He wasn't filing this. "Say that again," he said. "Sit down, Dorian." "I don't want to sit down." "I know." She pulled out a chair from the kitchen island anyway, set it facing him, and sat down herself. A deliberate choice. She was not going to stand across from him like a defendant. She was going to sit, and she was going to speak, and she was going to give him the truth in the only order it could be given. The order that might leave the two of them still in the same room when it was finished. He came in slowly. He didn't take the chair. He stood at the counter with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes on her, and she understood that this was how he needed to receive it. On his feet. Ready. "The financial architecture," she said. "The encrypted communications network. The political contacts in the capital. The ones you've used 3 times to make federal investigations disappear. The port arrangement in Baltimore that Munn managed. The real estate holdings that clean the money. The medical network that keeps your injured men off hospital records." She paused. "All of it. I built all of it." He said nothing. "I didn't build it in spite of you," she said. "I built it because of you. Because I knew what you were trying to create, and I knew it would collapse without an infrastructure you didn't know how to construct. Not because you weren't capable. Because you didn't have the knowledge I had. The specific kind of knowledge that only comes from growing up inside something like this." Something shifted in his face then. A small thing. A tightening around the eyes. "Growing up inside something like what?" he said. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind in the abstract, many times over 15 years, not because she planned to ever speak it, she had planned never to speak it, but because her mind was the kind of mind that ran contingency scenarios automatically, the way a pilot mentally rehearses emergency procedures they never expect to use. None of the rehearsals had felt like this. "My family name isn't Vale," she said. "Vale was a construction. I built it when I was 22 years old with documentation that took 18 months, and favors from people I will tell you about later." She kept her voice level. Not cold. Level. There was a difference. "My real name is Seraphine Morrow. My grandfather founded an organization called the Obsidian Circle. My father inherited it. My father was murdered for it when I was 14 years old. By his own brother, a man named Aldrich Morrow, who has controlled the circle ever since." The kitchen was very quiet. "The coin," Dorian said. "Yes." "On the eyes, the symbol. The circle's mark. Aldrich's mark." She looked at her hands for exactly 1 second, then back at him. "He's been watching us for years. I knew he would find me eventually. I built enough distance that I believed I had more time." "You believed." The word came out of him with an edge on it. "Yes." "You believed you had more time." He unfolded his arms, laid his palms flat on the counter. "While you were running my organization from behind a charity gala, you believed that some organization I have never heard of, run by the uncle who murdered your parents, was eventually going to find us, and you believed you had more time. I made a judgment. You made a judgment." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back down, something in his expression had moved past the initial contained fury into something harder and colder. "The 3 captains, Munn, Carraro, Pell." "Mine," she said quietly. "They were loyal to me first. He's been removing them in sequence, not to hurt your operations, to send me a message." "What's the message?" "Come home." She said it without inflection. "That's always been his message. that I belong to the circle, that I have a role I abandoned, that what I built here, what we built here, she caught the pronoun, held it, let it stand, belongs to him by right of bloodline. Dorian pushed off the counter. He walked to the window, the same window she had been standing at 20 minutes earlier, and he looked out at the same grounds, the same darkness, the same lights burning at the gate. Every time I closed a deal, he said, not turning around, every time I outmaneuvered a rival, every time I pulled us back from something that should have ended us. He stopped, started again. I thought I understood why I was good at this. You are good at it. Don't. The word was quiet, but it landed hard. Don't do that right now. She didn't. He stood at the window for a long time. She let him stand there. This was not a moment to fill with reassurance or explanation. She had spent 15 years being very good at knowing when a room needed to be quiet, and this room needed to be quiet. When he turned around, his face had done something she hadn't expected. It had settled. Not into acceptance, not yet, not nearly, but into the particular stillness that Dorian Vescari wore when he had decided to be functional in spite of what he was feeling. It was the quality she had loved in him from the beginning, the thing beneath all the ego and the controlled menace. He was not a man who broke when the floor dropped out. He staggered. He felt it, but he stayed upright. What does he actually want? Dorian said. She had been waiting for that question. It meant he was past the first shock. He was working. Not me, she said. He wants what I can access. When I left the circle, I didn't leave empty-handed. My father had systems, financial reserves, intelligence archives, a network of dormant assets in 11 countries, the kind of infrastructure that only activates through biometric authorization. My authorization. She let that settle. Aldrich has had 18 years to find a way around it. He hasn't. There are certain doors that only open from the inside. So he needs you alive. He needs me compliant. There's a difference. She held his eyes. Alive and broken. Alive and with someone I love under a gun. The word love moved through the room between them. He didn't look away from it. How much time do we have? He said. Days, maybe less. He's moving faster than I expected, which means something has changed in his timeline, some external pressure I haven't identified yet. Dorian nodded, one slow, deliberate nod. And the network, the parts he hasn't dismantled yet. Is there anything we can use? Yes, she said, but not through the channels you know. The systems I built have a second layer, a contingency architecture that my people in the organization didn't even know existed. Redundancies within redundancies. She paused. I built it before we met. When I first understood what you were building, I adapted it around you. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been living 2 lives for 15 years. I've been living 1 life, she said. I've been protecting it with everything I know. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It didn't have the charged, fractured quality of shock. It had weight. The weight of 2 people standing on either side of a truth that had just changed the entire shape of what they thought they knew. Dorian reached up and rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she knew. It meant he was exhausted and refusing to let it show, and doing both of those things simultaneously. The gardener, he said suddenly. She blinked. What? The one who trims the hedges, Kowalczyk. He's been with us 4 years. I hired him through a reference from Graves. She looked at him steadily. He's mine. I placed that reference 3 weeks before you received it. Dorian let out a long, controlled breath through his nose. How many people in this house? He said. 2 others. I'll tell you who. He turned back to the window. His reflection floated there against the darkness outside, and for a moment she could see both of them. Him in the glass, her behind him, the 2 of them framed in the kitchen light like a painting of something that was no longer quite what it had appeared to be. The Empire, he said, and the word came out of him stripped of its usual authority, just a word. I built the Empire. You did, she said, and she meant it. She meant it precisely. You made every decision. You absorbed every risk. You walked into rooms that should have killed you and walked back out. I gave you infrastructure. You gave it life. She stopped. Then, "The Empire is yours, Dorian. I just made sure the ground it stood on was solid." He didn't respond. Outside at the gate, the security light clicked on as the detail completed its rotation. And somewhere in the city, in a location she could narrow to three possibilities: a man with her family's name and her father's blood, and 18 years of cold patience, was looking at a map that showed him almost everything. Almost. He slept in the chair that night, not because she asked him to, and not because he was punishing her. Dorian wasn't that kind of man, or at least he had never been before tonight. He slept in the leather chair in the study with his jacket across his lap and his phone face down on the side table. And when Seraphine passed the doorway at 2 in the morning, she saw the line of his jaw in the dark, and the way his hands were still loosely closed, even in sleep, like a man who had not fully let go of something. She didn't wake him. She went to the east bedroom, opened the third drawer of the mahogany dresser, and removed the burner phone. She powered it on, waited, and sent a single number, 4, to a contact listed only as a string of digits. Then she removed the SIM card, snapped it, and flushed the pieces separately. She put the phone itself in her coat pocket. She would dispose of it in the morning, away from the house, at 3 different locations. She did not sleep. By 6 in the morning, she had mapped on paper, real paper, not a screen, everything she believed Aldrich knew and everything she believed he didn't. The paper would be burned before Dorian woke. She was not hiding it from him anymore, not exactly. But the habit of concealment ran deeper than intention. It was structural. It would take time to dismantle. Dorian woke at 6:40. She heard him moving in the study, heard the particular sound of a man realizing where he was and why, and then a long silence, and then his footsteps coming toward the kitchen. He looked like a man who had aged 3 years overnight, not in a diminished way, in the way of someone whose face had caught up with something his mind had been carrying. He poured coffee without speaking. She poured her own. They stood on opposite sides of the island and drank, and neither of them spoke for a full 2 minutes. And it was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. "Toussaint is going to want answers," he said. "I know. He's going to want to know why his intelligence network vanished, and why 3 of his colleagues are dead, and why nobody can explain the infrastructure he's been using for 8 years. I know." "What do I tell him?" She set down her cup. "The truth. A version of it." Dorian looked at her. "Which version?" "That there was a security architecture you kept compartmentalized, that it's been compromised, that you're rebuilding protocols." She held his gaze. "Not about me. Not yet. Not until I understand exactly who inside the organization has been reporting to Aldrich." Something moved across his face. "You think someone inside is feeding him?" "I think 3 captains died without a single witness and without leaving a recoverable trail. Someone created those gaps. Someone who understood exactly which surveillance blind spots to use." She paused. "The blind spots were part of a system I designed, which means whoever is talking to Aldrich has been talking to him for years, someone close." Dorian put his cup down with more force than he intended. The sound cracked through the kitchen. "Give me names," he said. "I have 3 possibilities. I need 48 hours to confirm." "We don't have 48 hours. "Then we have what we have." She kept her voice steady. "Dorian, if we move on the wrong person, Aldrich will know we're looking. He'll accelerate. We lose the only advantage we have right now, which is that he doesn't know I've told you anything." He stared at her. "He doesn't know." "He expects me to be managing you, keeping you calm, feeding you partial information while I try to negotiate with him in secret." She picked up her cup again. "He knows how I operate, or he thinks he does. He doesn't know I've changed." The word "changed" landed in the room between them with more weight than either of them acknowledged. Graves arrived at 9. He came alone, which was unusual. He was a compact man, Toussaint Graves, the kind of compact that came from discipline rather than genetics, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the deliberate posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that he would never give a room reason to underestimate him. He had been with Dorian for 9 years. He was the most senior person still standing. He came into the study, saw Seraphine seated in the corner chair with a book she wasn't reading, and stopped. "I didn't know this was—" "Sit down, Toussaint," Dorian said. Graves sat. He was too experienced to show what he was thinking, but his eyes moved to Seraphine once and then deliberately away, and that movement told her something about the shape of his suspicion. "The network," Dorian said. "I need you to tell me exactly what you've been able to recover." "Nothing," Graves said. "Not nothing like very little, nothing like gone. The relay servers in Detroit and Phoenix are physically intact but wiped. The contact in the capital stopped responding Tuesday. The accounting interface for the shell corporations." He paused. "It's there, but the access credentials have been rotated. None of our existing keys work." Dorian leaned forward. "Rotated to what?" "I don't know. It's not our rotation protocol. It's something else. Something I don't recognize." Seraphine turned a page of her book. She was very careful about the angle of her face. She had rotated those credentials herself 2 nights ago from the burner phone. A preemptive measure. It meant Aldrich's people couldn't access the financial system even if they had someone inside with partial credentials. It also meant Dorian's people couldn't access it. She would give Dorian the new keys before noon, but she needed to hear this conversation first. "Who built the original system?" Graves said. He wasn't looking at Dorian when he said it. He was looking at his own hands. "I asked Marta Pell that question 6 months ago. She told me to ask you." Dorian said nothing. "I didn't ask you," Graves continued, "because there were things in this organization I understood I wasn't supposed to ask about. That was the culture. You built it." He looked up. "But someone built a system that I've been operating inside for 9 years, and I don't know its architecture, and now it's been compromised, and 3 people are dead, and I am sitting here with no intelligence, no financial access, and no explanation." He stopped. "So I'm asking now." The room was very still. Dorian looked at Seraphine. Graves followed his eyes. And in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Seraphine watched Toussaint Graves understand something. Not the full truth, not yet, but the shape of it, the outline. She watched it move through him the way cold water moves through a system, finding every crack. "Mrs. Vescari," he said, carefully. "Toussaint," she said, "is there something you'd like to tell me?" It was not quite a question and not quite a threat, and carried in it the specific tension of a man who was deciding in real time how angry he was allowed to be. Dorian said, "She built the network." Graves turned back to him. "I'm sorry. The financial infrastructure, the intelligence relay, the political contacts, the shell corporation matrix." Dorian's voice was flat and controlled, and carrying beneath that flatness something that sounded like a man reciting losses. "She built it. Before we met. She rebuilt it around our operation in the first 3 years." He paused. "I didn't know." Graves sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, "How?" "She has a background she didn't disclose." "What kind of background?" "The kind," Dorian said, "that we're going to talk about fully, once I've confirmed the perimeter is clean and we've moved locations. What I need from you right now is the short list. Everyone who's had contact with the network infrastructure in the last 90 days. Graves nodded slowly. The anger was there. She could see it in his jaw, in the way he was holding himself very still, the way men do when they're deciding not to act on something. But he was a professional. He filed it. 7 people, he said. Marta Pell, who is dead. Carraro, who is dead. A man named Becker, who runs the Detroit Relay. A courier named Rosa Vega, who I've used for physical dead drops. 2 IT contacts I've never met in person, both managed through Carraro. He stopped. And a man named Solis. He came on 18 months ago, referral from Carraro. Seraphine looked up from her book. Solis, she said. First name. Graves looked at her. Dante Solis. He runs courier logistics on the Eastern Corridor. I know who he is. She closed the book, set it on the side table. Don't contact him. Don't let anyone contact him. And get someone you personally trust, not from the existing network, someone outside, to locate him in the next 2 hours. Graves looked at Dorian. Dorian said, Do it. Can I ask why? Graves said, and it was directed at Seraphine with a directness that had an edge on it. Because Dante Solis's referral came through Carraro, she said. And Carraro's contact database was one of the three things I didn't build myself. It was the one gap in the system. I always thought it was a minor vulnerability. She paused. I was wrong. Graves stood up. He straightened his jacket with the precise mechanical movement of a man who needed something to do with his hands. He looked at Seraphine with an expression she had seen on men before. Not hatred, something more complicated than that. The look of someone who has discovered that the map they've been navigating with was drawn by someone they didn't know. 9 years, he said. Yes. 9 years I thought I was working for Dorian Vescari. You were, she said. You are. But the ground under it was always going to hold, she said, until now. And now I'm going to fix it. But I need you working with me to do that, not working against me because your pride is hurt. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Graves walked out. Dorian didn't look at her. He was looking at the space Graves had occupied. He's not wrong to be angry. No, she said. He's not. Are you going to tell me there are others? People who are going to sit across from me and find out they've been... He stopped, chose the word carefully. Managed. Not managed, protected. She stood up. There's a difference. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen in 15 years of marriage. Not soft. Dorian Vescari's face was never soft, but open in a way that was almost harder to look at than anger would have been. It was the face of a man holding two contradictory truths and refusing to collapse either one. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to lead an organization when the ground rules have changed. You follow the blueprint, she said. For the first time you follow mine instead of your instincts. He breathed out through his nose. That's going to be the hardest thing you've ever asked me. I know, she said. I know exactly how hard it is. I've been doing the reverse for 15 years. The call came at 11:42, not through any channel she had built. Through Dorian's personal mobile, the number that existed, as far as anyone knew, in maybe 8 contacts in the world. It rang once, and something about that single ring made both of them go still. Dorian looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered on speaker. The voice was measured, unhurried, warm in the way that very cold things are sometimes warm, the way metal is warm right before it burns you. Dorian, the voice said, I want to begin by saying I have enormous respect for what you've built, genuinely. A man with your resources and your instincts. It's rare. The Underworld doesn't produce men like you often. Dorian said nothing. I also want to say, the voice continued, that none of what's coming is about you. You're an innocent party to a family matter. I want you to understand that. Whatever Seraphine has told you, and I imagine she's told you quite a bit in the last 12 hours, I want you to know that I have no interest in harming you. You're collateral to a conversation that's been waiting 18 years to happen. Seraphine was standing very still on the other side of the room. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was exactly the face she wore at charity galas and museum openings, composed and present and giving nothing. But Dorian could see her breathing. Who is this? He said, even though they both knew. My name is Aldrich Morrow, the voice said. I'm Seraphine's uncle, and I'm calling to make you a single offer before this becomes something neither of us wants it to become. A pause. Give her to me, not harmed, unharmed, with her full cooperation. In exchange, I'll dismantle every operation I have targeting your organization, return control of your financial network, and ensure that the Viscari name is never touched by anything connected to the Obsidian Circle again. Another pause. You have until midnight. The call ended. The room was very quiet. Dorian set the phone down on the desk. He looked at it. He did not look at Seraphine. She did not look away from him. Dorian, she said, don't. His voice came out low and rough and stripped of its usual architecture. Just don't talk for a second. She waited. He stood there with his hand flat on the desk and his head bent slightly, and she watched him work through something she could not see and could not help him with. This was his alone. The moment a man discovers that the ground of his life has a different geography than he thought, that the empire he believed he built on his own ability is resting on something he didn't plant, and he has to decide in real time whether that diminishes the empire or just changes what it means. Then he picked up the phone. "I'm calling Graves," he said. "Dorian, not to give you to anyone." He looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes she had fallen in love with 20 years ago in a bar in Lower Manhattan, when he was still just a dangerous man with remarkable self-possession, and she was already something far more complicated, pretending to be simpler than she was. "We're moving. Tonight. Everything. Everyone. Every resource we still have. We're going to do this your way." He paused. "But I'm going to need you to trust me with all of it, not some of it. All of it." She was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," she said. "Something I haven't told you yet." He closed his eyes briefly. "Of course there is. Aldrich didn't find us by tracking me," she said. "He's been inside this organization longer than I've been in it. There's someone who has been reporting to him since before you and I met." She held his gaze. "Someone who was already here when I arrived. Someone who watched me build everything and fed Aldrich the architectural plans piece by piece." Dorian went very still. "Someone who has been in this organization longer than you've known me," she said. He looked at her. "Toussaint," he said. Not a question. A word falling. She didn't answer immediately. She let him sit in the uncertainty of it. Not to be cruel, but because a premature answer was more dangerous than the silence. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the truth. I have a suspicion, and I need 12 more hours to confirm it." Dorian looked down at the phone in his hand. Outside, somewhere in the house, a door closed. The sound of it moved through the walls like something final, and neither of them spoke, and the clock on the study wall read 11:59 in the morning, and somewhere in the city a man named Aldrich Morrow was waiting for an answer that would never come in the form he expected, but was coming nonetheless, moving through channels he thought he understood, in a shape he had catastrophically failed to anticipate. They moved at 2 in the afternoon, which was Seraphine's choice. Not at night, not in the dark, which was what every instinct in Dorian's body told him to do. Move in darkness, move quiet, move the way he had always moved when the pressure came down. She had said no. She had said moving at night was what Aldrich expected, and Aldrich had people watching the estate, and the watches would be heaviest between 10 and 4 in the morning because that was when his people had always moved, and Aldrich knew his people because Aldrich had been watching his people for longer than any of them understood. So they moved at 2 in the afternoon in 3 separate vehicles that looked like nothing. A florist's van, a private car service sedan, a utilities truck that had been parked 2 blocks from the estate for 11 days and that nobody on the security detail had flagged because Seraphine had arranged for it to be there 11 days ago and had told the detail to leave it alone. She had arranged it before she knew this was coming. That was the part Dorian kept turning over in his mind as the sedan moved through afternoon traffic. She had prepared the exit before the crisis. She had built the contingency before there was anything to be contingent about. The way a surgeon leaves a drain in a wound because they know what wounds do, not because they can predict when. He sat beside her in the back of the sedan and watched the city move past the tinted window and said nothing. Graves was in the utilities truck. They had not told him the destination. They had given him a grid coordinate that resolved to a parking structure in the Flatiron district, with instructions to wait on the 4th level and not use his phone. He had looked at Dorian when he received the instructions. Dorian had held his gaze and said nothing. Graves had gone. The safe house was not a house. It was the upper 2 floors of a commercial printing business, in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying for 15 years without quite finishing the process, leaving it in a permanent state of half-transformation. Old warehouses beside artisan coffee shops, loading docks next to wine bars, the kind of urban texture that made surveillance difficult because there was always too much to look at. The printing business was legitimate. It had 3 employees who had no knowledge of the upper floors. The upper floors were accessed through a service stairwell with a coded entry that changed on a 48-hour rotation. Seraphine had the current code. She had the codes for 11 properties in 4 cities. She held them in her memory, not in any device, not written anywhere. The codes changed on schedules she tracked mentally, the same way some people track appointments or medication schedules. It was a system she had built into her thinking so long ago that it no longer felt like effort. It felt like breathing. The rooms upstairs were clean and functional and deliberately anonymous. 2 work tables, 6 chairs, a bank of monitors that were currently dark, a communications rig that was encrypted at a level that would take any government agency with current technology between 6 and 9 months to crack. A small kitchen. 2 cots in a back room she had never used. She used the second work table now, powering up systems while Dorian stood in the center of the room and looked at all of it with the expression of a man standing inside a structure he had just discovered exists. "How many of these do you have?" he said. 11 active, 14 dormant. Dormant meaning clean and stocked, but not in current rotation, which makes them harder to identify because they show no energy or communication signature. He turned slowly, taking it in. "This one. How long?" 7 years. He stopped turning. 7 years ago, she said, not looking up from the monitor, you had a problem with a federal prosecutor who was building a RICO case around your port operations. You remember. I remember. You handled it through a contact in the Capitol. You thought the contact was yours. He was mine. I'd had him in place for 4 years at that point. The RICO case disappeared not because of pressure in the Capitol, but because I had sourced and delivered to a specific Senate oversight staffer a package of information about the prosecutor's own financial irregularities. She paused. I ran that operation from this room. Dorian sat down, not in the deliberate way he usually sat, the controlled lowering of a man who chooses his posture. He sat the way people sit when their legs make the decision first. I need you to tell me, he said. Everything, all of it, from the beginning. We don't have time for make time. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was holding too many things at once, and the effort of holding them was showing in the muscles around his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands, which were on the table in front of him, flat, the way they'd been on the kitchen counter last night, and she understood that this was not a request he was making. This was the one thing he needed before he could function. She sat down across from him. She told him, not everything. There wasn't time for everything, and some of it was the kind of past that needed more than a single afternoon in a safe house to be received properly. But she told him the architecture of it, her grandfather, her father, the circle's structure and reach, the way she had been raised inside it, not as a child exactly, but as a succession plan. Educated in 7 disciplines simultaneously, languages and finance and intelligence methodology and network theory, and the specific applied knowledge of how criminal organizations fail and why. She had been 14 when her father died. She had been 19 when she understood completely what Aldrich had done and why. She had been 22 when she had finished dismantling her own identity and built a new one clean enough to walk away from everything. She had been 26 when she met Dorian Viscari in a bar in Lower Manhattan and understood within 40 minutes that she was going to love him in a way she hadn't planned for. She told him that too. He didn't speak through any of it. He watched her the way he watched things he was trying to memorize, with a stillness that was not passivity but attention, the kind of attention that costs something. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. The 3 possibilities, he said finally, for the informant. You said 12 hours. I have a narrower picture now. She turned to the monitor, pulled up a file she had been building remotely for 72 hours. Dante Solis is confirmed clean. I had him located this morning. He's been in Philadelphia for 6 days at a family event that checks out completely. He's not our leak. She paused, which removes the Corraro connection as the entry point. Then where? The leak is older than Corraro. The leak predates the financial system. She zoomed in on a section of the file. I've been running communication pattern analysis on every person with any access to the network infrastructure over the past 3 years, looking for timing correlations, moments when operational information reached Aldrich within hours of being generated inside our organization. She stopped. Dorian leaned forward. There are 4 correlation clusters, she said. 4 periods where our information reached Aldrich fast enough that the leak had to be someone at the center of operations, not the periphery. Someone who heard things directly. She looked at him. The clusters correspond to 4 specific decisions you made in the past 3 years. 4 private decisions, the kind of decision a man makes with his most trusted counsel. The silence that followed had a different quality than all the previous silences. Toussaint, Dorian said. No, she said. He looked at her. The 4 decisions, she said carefully. Toussaint was present for 3 of them, but the 4th one, the decision you made 14 months ago to restructure the port operations and move the primary terminal from Baltimore to Wilmington, Toussaint wasn't in that meeting. Dorian's face changed. That meeting had 4 people in it, he said. 3 now. Munn is dead. He stood up. He stood up so fast the chair moved and he turned away from her, and she watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the particular physical language of a man absorbing something his body understood before his mind was ready to accept it. Becker, he said. I think so. Yes. Becker has been with me for 12 years. I know. He was in my brother's crew before my brother died. He came to me out of loyalty. I know, Dorian. He turned around. His face was contained, but his eyes were not. Becker is the one who recommended Corraro. The words landed in the room and stayed there. She watched him work through the cascade of it, the way the implication moved through 12 years of shared history and retroactively altered the color of every memory it touched. She had watched men receive information like this before. It was always the same, and it was never the same. There was no way to prepare someone for the specific weight of discovering that the person they trusted longest was the one who had been killing them slowest. Where is he? Dorian said. His voice had dropped an octave and gone very flat. That's the problem, she said. As of 6 hours ago, Becker can't be located. He stared at her. He's gone, she said. His apartment is clean. Not packed and left clean, cleaned clean. Professional wipe. The car he uses is parked at Reagan National. No flight in his name, no rental, no hotel. He's been extracted. Aldrich pulled him out, which means Aldrich knows we're moving. Becker must have flagged something before he disappeared. She turned back to the monitors, which means Aldrich is accelerating. The midnight deadline wasn't real. It was a pressure tool. He moved his timeline up the moment Becker went dark. She pulled up a second screen. This one showed a map. Not a street map, but a network map. Nodes and connections and overlapping layers, the kind of visualization that looked like abstract art to an untrained eye and like a blueprint to hers. There's something else, she said. She had been deciding since early morning whether to say this next part. She had decided, on the drive here, that the only version of this that worked was the version where she said all of it. The original 11 nodes of the Obsidian Circle's North American network. I mapped them before I left. I've been tracking them passively for 18 years. She pointed to 3 nodes on the screen. 3 of them have gone dark in the last 72 hours. Not destroyed. Gone dark. Which in the Circle's protocol means one thing. What? They're being called in, consolidated. She looked at him. Aldrich is assembling the full Circle. Every family, every enforcement arm, every political asset they have on the continent. He's not coming with a team. He's coming with an army. The door opened. Graves walked in. He was moving wrong. Too fast. Too tight. The particular physical quality of a man carrying something urgent. He had a phone in his hand and his face was stripped of its usual composure. He stopped when he saw the monitors. He stopped and looked at the network map, and then at Seraphine, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. There's a body, he said. Rosa Vega, the courier. They found her in the parking structure where you sent me to wait. He looked at Dorian. 4th level. She'd been there for approximately 4 hours, before we arrived. He paused. There was a coin. Nobody spoke. She wasn't ours, Graves said, and the word ours came out with the specific weight of a man who has spent the last several hours renegotiating what that word means. She was one of yours. He looked at Seraphine directly. Wasn't she? Yes, Seraphine said. How many more? Of mine specifically? 3 left in the active network. Everyone else has been relocated or has gone dark on my instruction. She held his gaze. Graves, the parking structure. You said she'd been there 4 hours. Approximately. The ME hasn't. 4 hours ago, we were still at the estate. She stood up. Aldrich's people were in that parking structure before I sent you there. The room processed that. He knew the location, Dorian said. He knew the location. She was already moving back to the monitors, which means one of two things. Either this safe house has a 3-layer coordinate system, and this address was one of the 3, in which case he may know where we are right now. Or, Graves said, or he's been inside my contingency network longer than I thought. She pulled up a third screen. Her hands were moving faster than usual, not frantic, but faster, the speed of someone running a diagnostic under time pressure. I need 10 minutes. We may not have 10 minutes, Dorian said. Then let me use the ones we have. She worked. They let her work. Dorian stood behind her and to the left, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, which was not comfort exactly, but was something. The physical fact of him still present, still in the room, not gone. Graves stood near the door with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between the monitors and the entry point and back again, doing what he was built to do, which was read a room for threat. 7 minutes in, she found it. It was not subtle. That was the thing that hit her like something physical. It was not subtle at all, which meant it was not meant to be hidden from her. It was meant to be found. It was meant to be found by her specifically at a moment when finding it would do maximum damage. A mirror. Someone had built a passive mirror of her network architecture. Not a clone, a mirror, ingesting every communication and coordinate and operational decision in real time and routing it to an external relay. The mirror had been constructed with such precision that it used her own encryption protocols, her own dead drop methodology, her own timing parameters. It had been running for 4 years. Not Becker. Becker couldn't have built this. Becker was a driver who'd risen to logistics, competent, loyal, now treacherous, but not capable of this level of technical architecture. She sat very still. What? Dorian said, reading her. She pointed at a section of the code. This mirror was built by someone who understood my system from the inside. The structural logic, the way the encryption layers interact, the timing intervals, the dead drop parameters. She turned slowly in the chair. This wasn't built by someone Aldrich sent to infiltrate. This was built by someone who was already inside my network when I built it. She stopped. Someone who was inside the Obsidian Circle when I designed these protocols. Graves said, "When did you design them?" "Before I left," she said. "When I was still inside." The implication settled over the room like temperature dropping. "Aldrich didn't find you," Dorian said slowly. "He never lost you." "He's been watching since the beginning," she said. "The last 18 years. He let me build everything. He let me construct the whole architecture." She heard her own voice as if from a slight distance, steady and strange. "He waited until it was complete." Her phone, the new one, the clean one she'd activated 2 hours ago from a number no one had, vibrated on the table. She looked at the screen. One message. No sender identification. It read, "You built the door. I always had the key. A." And then her second monitor, the one running the network diagnostic, went white. Not dark. White. All nodes simultaneously. A total system flush. And then a single line of text appeared across the blank screen in a font she recognized from childhood, the typeface the Circle used for formal communications, the one that appeared on documents of consequence. It read, "The Regent of the Obsidian Circle formally charges Seraphine Morrow with abandonment of succession." Sentence. Forfeiture of all constructed assets. Enforcement authorized continent-wide. All affiliated families notified. Compliance window, 6 hours. The screen went blank. Graves read it. Looked at Seraphine. Looked at Dorian. Dorian was looking at Seraphine. Her face was doing something none of them had seen it do before. Not breaking. She was not a woman who broke. The mechanism for breaking had been engineered out of her at an age when most children were learning to ride bicycles. But something beneath the composure was showing through, the way the structure of a building shows through when the exterior finish fails. Something old. Something that had been carrying enormous weight for a very long time, and had just been handed more. Every criminal family on the continent, Graves said. His voice had lost its professional flatness. That's what all affiliated families means? 17 families, she said. North and Central America, plus enforcement arms in 6 additional jurisdictions. She stood up. They're not going to come for us directly. They're going to make it impossible for us to move. Every contact we have will be pressured. Every legitimate business we hold will be targeted. Every safe house I've built, and Aldrich now has the full list, will be watched. She looked at Dorian. He's sealed the continent. Dorian said, Then we go through him. With what? Graves said, and it came out rawer than he intended. With what, Dorian? Our 3 remaining people? The woman who has just informed us that the man trying to kill us has been watching every move she's made for 18 years. She built redundancies, Dorian said. She said redundancies within redundancies. Is that true? He looked at her. Yes, she said. Does Aldrich know about the second layer? She thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. If he knew about the second layer, she said, he wouldn't have sent me a message. He would have used it to shut everything down already. The mirror he built was inside the primary architecture. She paused. The second layer runs on a completely different logic. I built it using protocols I developed after I left the Circle. Protocols that don't exist anywhere in the Circle's institutional knowledge. Graves looked between them. So there's a second network, he said. There's a second network, she confirmed, and Aldrich doesn't know it exists. Not yet. How long before he figures it out? She looked at the blank monitor, at the white space where her primary network had been, wiped clean in a single coordinated flush by a man who had waited 18 years to press one button. Hours, she said. Maybe less. He'll start pulling the architecture apart the moment he realizes the primary network doesn't contain the financial assets he's looking for. When he hits the first dead end, he'll know there's something else. She paused. We have one move. One. And we have to make it before he starts pulling. She reached under the second work table. There was a panel there, flush with the underside, painted to match the table's surface. She pressed a specific point on it, and it released, and inside was a hard drive in a case, and inside the case was a secondary communications unit and a list. Handwritten, the only handwritten document she had produced in 18 years, of 11 names, 11 addresses, and 11 contact protocols. She set it on the table. Dorian looked at it. The second network, she said. People Aldrich has never seen. People I built relationships with after I left, through channels that have no overlap with anything the Circle has ever touched. She looked at both of them. And one other thing. She placed her hand flat on the list. Aldrich's Fortress. The location he's been operating from. I've known it for 4 years. I've been watching it the same way he's been watching me. She paused. The difference is, he doesn't know I know. Graves exhaled through his teeth. Dorian looked at his wife across the table. This woman he had married 20 years ago and discovered this week and was discovering still, and he said quietly, the way a man speaks when he is done performing certainty he doesn't feel and is just telling the truth. Tell me what we need to do. And Seraphine Morrow, who had been carrying the weight of 2 lives and one enormous secret for longer than most people sustain any single conviction, looked at her husband and then at the man who had spent 9 years inside the organization she built, and understood that the next thing she said would either save all 3 of them or finish what Aldrich had started. She picked up the list. We're going to need to disappear, she said, and then we're going to need to reappear somewhere he will never expect. They disappeared at 4:17 in the afternoon. Not dramatically. That was the thing about real disappearances. They didn't look like anything. A printing business on a half-gentrified block closed its front door at what appeared to be the end of a workday. 3 people walked out through a loading dock exit into an alley that connected to a cross street, and on that cross street a panel van was idling, and the panel van moved into traffic and became part of the city, and the city swallowed it the way cities swallow everything, indifferently, completely. Seraphine sat in the back with the hard drive case on her lap, and the handwritten list folded inside her jacket, and her eyes closed. Not sleeping, but running calculations. She had been running calculations for so long that the process no longer felt voluntary. It was just how her mind moved, the way some people tap their fingers or track ambient sound. Her mind built models and tested them and collapsed the ones that failed and rebuilt from the rubble. Dorian sat beside her. Their shoulders were touching. Neither of them acknowledged it. Graves drove. He drove without being told where, following a route Seraphine fed him in short increments. 2 blocks north, left, through the parking structure, out the east exit. A counter-surveillance pattern that added 11 minutes to any direct route but made tracking the vehicle require resources that would be visible. She was watching for visible resources. She saw none. That worried her more than seeing them would have. The second safe house was a storage unit facility in a neighborhood that smelled of diesel and old industry, the kind of facility that rented by the month to small businesses and people with too much furniture, and nobody asked questions because the business model depended on nobody asking questions. Unit 44, ground level, corner position. The unit was 20 feet deep, and when you moved the shelving units against the left wall, there was a door. And behind the door was a room that had power and ventilation and a communications setup that made the printing facility's system look preliminary. She had built this one 8 years ago. She had never told anyone it existed, not a single person in any network she had ever operated. When she opened the door and turned on the lights, Dorian looked at the room and then at her and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She powered up the secondary communications array. "First contact in 40 minutes, she said. "I need both of you to understand something before that happens." She sat down, not at the console but facing them, because this needed to be received as a human thing, not a briefing. "The people I'm about to contact have never been connected to anything you know. They don't know your names. They don't know the Vescari organization. They know me as someone else, like a name I used for 12 years before I became Seraphine Vale." She paused. "When I make contact, I will be that person. You will not speak. You will not be identified. Whatever you hear, you hold." Graves said, "What name?" "Marin Cole." Dorian looked at her, a quick look, the look of a man encountering another layer of a thing he thought he had gotten to the bottom of. "How many names?" he said. "3 total. Vale, which you know. Moro, which is blood. Cole, which is work." She held his gaze. "Cole is the one that will get us inside that fortress." She turned to the console. The first contact was a woman in Vancouver who answered a specific frequency at a specific time window and had been doing so monthly for 11 years against the possibility that Marin Cole would need her. She went by the operational name Strand. She had a voice like someone who had smoked heavily and quit 10 years ago and still carried the texture of it. She did not express surprise when the frequency activated. She said, "How long do we have?" "Hours," Seraphine said. "Maybe less." "What do you need?" "I need the Circle's current enforcement roster for the Northeast Corridor, and I need a physical layout of the Harrogate facility. Current, not the one from 4 years ago." A pause. "The Harrogate layout changed 14 months ago. Full internal restructure." "I know. That's why I need the current one. It'll cost you the Vancouver account." "Agreed." Dorian was watching her. She could feel it without seeing it, the specific quality of his attention when he was absorbing something he couldn't yet categorize. Strand said, "Give me 20 minutes." The second contact was a man in Baltimore who had spent 30 years building and dismantling security systems for people who paid in cash and required discretion in both directions. He went by Ferris. He was 61 years old and had twice declined offers from agencies that would have paid him 3 times what he earned because he valued his autonomy above his income and had the financial discipline to make that choice sustainable. He picked up in 4 seconds. "Marin," he said. "I need a schematic bypass for a biometric lock system," she said. "Circle generation hardware. 3rd-tier architecture, probably installed within the last 2 years given the timeline of their last internal restructure." Ferris made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Circle hardware. You're going in." "Yes." "The bypass I can build. The installation is a different conversation." "I'm doing the installation myself." This time the sound was definitely not a laugh. "You haven't done field installation in, I know how long it's been, Can you build it or not? I can build it. I need 6 hours. You have 4. He hung up without responding, which meant yes. The third contact didn't answer. She tried twice. The frequency was clean. No interference, no block, simply no response. She sat with that for a moment, then tried a backup channel. Nothing. She looked at the contact list. The third name was a man she'd placed inside the Circle's financial administration 8 years ago, the deepest asset she had ever run, the one who had access to the internal account architecture that she would need to execute the final component of her plan. Without him, the last step, the one that made everything else irreversible, required her to be physically inside the Circle's system rather than operating remotely. Problem, Graves said. He was reading her face. Possibly. She set the list down. We proceed as if the third contact is burned. It changes the physical requirement for the last phase, but it doesn't change the approach. She looked at Dorian. It means I have to go in deeper than I planned. Define deeper. The biometric authorization that Aldrich needs from me, the one he's been trying to extract for 18 years, it's not a single key. It's a sequential system. 3 physical inputs administered in a specific order. My handprint, a retinal scan, and a vocal authorization code that changes on a 72-hour cycle. She paused. Aldrich knows the first 2. He's assumed for 18 years that the third was stored somewhere. A device, a document, a trusted intermediary. He's been looking for where. She stopped. It's not stored anywhere. It lives here. She touched her temple. Which means the only way he gets it is if I give it to him. And the only way I give it to him is if he has something I can't afford to lose. Dorian said, Me. That was his plan, she said. Walk me in with you under a gun. I authorize the accounts. He takes the assets, eliminates the witnesses, and the Obsidian Circle inherits an empire I spent 20 years building. Graves said, Was his plan? She confirmed. I'm going to give him a version of it that looks identical from the outside. She reached into the hard drive case and removed a secondary device, a modified unit that looked like a standard communications tool and was not. The authorization code I give him will be real. My handprint will be real. My retinal scan will be real. Every biometric will be authentic because the system is designed to detect coercion responses and it will flag anything that isn't genuine. She set the device on the console. But the accounts he unlocks will not be the ones he thinks he's unlocking. The room was very quiet. 4 years ago, she said, I began a slow migration. Every real asset, every dollar, every holding, every piece of the financial architecture that actually has value, I moved it, layer by layer, over 48 months into a separate structure that the primary system points to but doesn't contain. She looked at Dorian. What Aldrich unlocks will be a perfect replica, complete in every visible way. It will take his people between 6 and 10 hours to run full verification on what they've received. She paused. By which time the replica will have already begun its own dissolution sequence. Dorian leaned forward. And the real assets. Already beyond anyone's reach to seize through violence. She held his eyes. I'm going to tell you something now that I should have told you 3 years ago. The empire, the real financial mass of everything we've built. It hasn't been in our names or any criminal structure's name for 4 years. It's been moving through a series of legitimate foundations and blind trusts and anonymized investment vehicles that are controlled by no individual and no organization. She paused. I made it impossible to inherit through force. I made it impossible to seize. The only access to it requires legal process through 7 jurisdictions over a minimum of 4 years. She stopped. I did it without asking you because I knew you would say no. Dorian was very still. You took my empire, he said. I protected it, she said, the same way I've protected everything else, by making sure nobody could take it from us with a gun. He stood up, turned away. The muscles in his back were rigid under his shirt, and she watched him breathe. 2 long, deliberate breaths, the kind a man takes when he is deciding not to say the first thing that comes to him. Then Graves said, If this works. If you walk in there, give him the fake access, and he burns 6 hours figuring out it's empty. What happens to us in those 6 hours? We use them, she said. To do what? To give the Circle's enforcement roster to every federal agency that has an open file on their affiliated families. To release the internal financial records I've been archiving for 4 years. Records that document every bribe, every political purchase, every law enforcement compromise the Circle has made on the continent. She looked at him steadily. I burn them. Completely. Every protection they've built, every public official they own, every piece of cover they've accumulated, I release it all simultaneously through a coordinated media and intelligence channel I've been building for 3 years. She paused. By the time Aldrich realizes the assets are empty, he'll have federal agencies hitting every node of his network simultaneously. His own affiliated families will be scrambling to protect themselves, and the political cover that makes the Circle untouchable will be gone. Graves sat down slowly. You've been planning this for years, he said. I've been planning this since the day I left, she said. I just needed a reason to pull the trigger. The 4th hour was the hardest. Ferris delivered the bypass unit through a courier Seraphine intercepted personally at a prearranged corner 2 blocks from the storage facility. The unit was smaller than she expected. A flat disc, matte black, the diameter of a poker chip. And when she turned it in her fingers, she felt the particular weight of something that had been built with extraordinary precision, the density of fine engineering in a minimal form. She also intercepted, at the same corner, a package from Strand. The Harrogate layout was extensive. She spread it on the console and studied it for 40 minutes, while Dorian and Graves ate from provisions she had stored in the unit and didn't speak much. She ate nothing. She had learned long ago that she processed better hungry, not starved, just empty enough that the body's resources weren't diverted. Harrogate was a decommissioned steel foundry 40 miles outside the city that had been purchased through 11 intermediary entities by a Circle-affiliated holding company 6 years ago. The internal restructure Strand had mentioned was significant. What had been an open industrial floor was now a subdivided interior of steel-reinforced rooms connected by elevated catwalks with controlled access points at each transition. The communication center was on the upper level, northeast quadrant. The biometric authorization terminal, the one Aldrich needed her to access, was in the central room, which the schematic labeled simply as the floor. There were 4 external entry points. 3 were actively monitored. The 4th, a maintenance access on the building's western face, originally used for equipment extraction during the foundry's operational years, was listed in the new schematic but marked as sealed. It was not sealed. She knew this because she had been inside Harrogate once, 7 years ago, during a period when the facility was between tenants, and she had used the vacancy to do something she had told no one about. She had wired it, not with explosives, with signals, a passive network of microtransmitters distributed through the structural steel that fed environmental data, heat signatures, acoustic patterns, movement, to a receiver that had been sitting dormant in her secondary network for 7 years, waiting. She activated the receiver now. The console lit up with a picture of the interior. 41 heat signatures. She counted them twice. 41 people inside Harrogate, distributed through the structure in a pattern that told her immediately which rooms were command, which were holding, and which were positioned for enforcement. Dorian came to stand beside her. He looked at the screen. 41, he said. Yes. We have 3. We have 11, she said. The other 8 are already moving. She pointed to the console. While Ferris was building the bypass and Strand was pulling the layout, I was making calls. The second network, Marin Cole's people, 8 of them are converging on Harrogate right now from 4 directions. They're not soldiers, they're specialists. Exactly the kind of people you need when you're not trying to win a firefight. She paused. You can't beat 41 armed people with 11. But you don't need to beat them. You need to get me to the floor, get me to that terminal, and hold the perimeter long enough for the authorization to complete. How long does authorization take? 90 seconds. And after, the dissolution sequence begins automatically. 6 hours on Aldrich's end. Simultaneous release of everything I have on the Circle goes out through a dead man's switch I've been maintaining for 4 years. It activates the moment I send a specific signal from inside Harrogate confirming I'm out. She turned to face him. If I don't send that signal within 3 hours of entering, it releases anyway. Graves said, and if you don't come out? The question sat in the room. Then it still releases, she said, and everything I've described still happens. It just happens without me. Dorian said, that's not an option. It's a contingency. It's not an option. His voice had the quality of something that had been decided before it was spoken. We go in together. We come out together. If that means the plan changes shape, we change shape with it. She looked at him for a moment. The storage unit's overhead light was utilitarian and flat, and it lit his face without flattery, showed every line, every year, every decision. She had looked at this face for 20 years and understood it the way you understand a language you learned before you were conscious of learning, completely, without translation. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. Aldrich will be expecting me to come alone. He's been counting on it. The offer he made you, deliver her, or face the war, it was designed to put you in an impossible position because he knows a man like you doesn't hand over his wife. He knows you'll fight, but he's calculated that you'll fight outward, against the affiliated families, trying to hold territory while I'm supposed to be negotiating with him privately. She paused. He doesn't know we've had this conversation. He doesn't know you know everything. She paused again. He also doesn't know that I have his facility mapped, his interior monitored, and his financial architecture pre-wired to empty itself the moment I authorize it. So his entire operation tonight, Graves said slowly, is based on a version of you that stopped existing the moment you told Dorian the truth. Yes. He's walking into something he built for a woman who doesn't exist anymore. Yes. Graves exhaled through his nose. It was not quite a laugh and not quite relief, and it was the closest thing to either that the room had contained in several hours. Dorian picked up his jacket. Then let's go be something he didn't plan for, he said. They left the storage unit at 9:41. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes sound carry, and as Seraphine walked to the vehicle, she could feel the weight of the bypass unit in her jacket pocket and the handwritten list against her ribs and the activation code for the dead man's switch sitting in her memory alongside the 72-hour vocal authorization and the 11 names and the 40 years of everything she had been and become and chosen and refused. They drove for 38 minutes without speaking. When the lights of Harrogate appeared on the horizon, not dramatic, just industrial illumination in the dark, orange, and functional against the black, Seraphine reached across and put her hand over Dorian's where it rested on his knee. He turned it over, held it. Neither of them spoke. Graves killed the headlights 400 meters out and took them off-road on ground that had once been a service track and was now overgrown enough to be invisible from the road. He stopped the vehicle in a tree line that didn't appear on any mapping satellite because she had checked 7 years ago, and the canopy coverage was sufficient for concealment of a single vehicle. Through the windshield, the western face of Harrogate was visible. The maintenance access. The sealed door that wasn't sealed. Seraphine's phone vibrated once. A message from a contact identifier she recognized as one of the 8 incoming specialists. 4 words. We are in position. She showed it to Dorian. He read it, nodded. She looked at the building. Somewhere inside it, her father's brother was sitting in a room that had once processed steel, waiting for a version of this moment that looked entirely different from the one that was coming, with 41 armed people between himself and a woman he believed he still controlled. He had waited 18 years. She had waited 18 years and 1 day longer. She opened the door and the cold air came in, and she stepped out onto the dead grass, and Dorian stepped out behind her, and Graves stepped out behind him, and the 3 of them stood in the tree line looking at the lit building and the dark distance between where they stood and where this ended. And Seraphine took 1 breath, just one, just enough. And then she walked forward into the dark, and the 2 men followed her into the night toward the one door in that fortress that Aldrich Morrow had never thought to watch because he had never known she had been inside it before. The maintenance door was exactly as she had left it 7 years ago. Externally, it looked sealed, a weld bead running the full perimeter, oxidized and convincing, the kind of detail that passed visual inspection and fooled anyone who didn't know that the weld was cosmetic, applied over a frame she had re-engineered to open inward on a magnetic release keyed to a specific frequency. She pulled the modified unit from her jacket. Not the bypass disc, a separate transmitter, smaller, that she had built into what looked like a standard key fob. She pressed it once. The door released with a sound like a breath. Dorian was directly behind her. She could hear him breathing, controlled, measured, the breathing of a man who had walked into dangerous rooms before and knew that the body's panic response was a resource you managed rather than suppressed. Graves was behind him, and she had told Graves before they left the vehicle that his role was the door and the corridor, not the floor. And he had not argued because Graves was a man who understood assigned roles and the cost of exceeding them. Inside, the air was different. Industrial cold, the kind that lives in steel and concrete long after the exterior temperature drops, layered with something that smelled of machine oil and age, and underneath that, faintly, the particular smell of too many people in an enclosed space. 41 people. She had counted them on the heat map, and she counted them now in her mind, distributed through the structure above and around her, and she tracked the ones that mattered. The maintenance corridor was narrow and unlit, and she moved through it from memory, one hand trailing the left wall, counting doorways. 3 doorways on the left before the corridor bent right. After the bend, a steel staircase that accessed the main floor from the west, coming out behind a structural column that would put them at the periphery of the floor with the central terminal 40 feet ahead and the primary guard concentration at the eastern access points. She had mapped this 7 years ago. She had mapped it because she had known, at some level she didn't fully articulate even to herself, that she would need it eventually. That walking away was not the same as being free. That men like Aldrich Morrow don't accept a closed door. They wait for the person behind it to need something badly enough to open it themselves. She had just spent 20 years making sure that when she opened it, she chose the terms. The staircase was where the first problem was. She heard it before she reached it. 2 voices, low, the specific murmur of men at a post who are bored and trying not to show it. She stopped, held up one fist behind her without turning. Dorian stopped. A moment later, she felt his hand on her shoulder. Not gripping, just present, a physical relay of information. He could hear them too. 2 men at the base of the staircase, not on the map, which meant they'd been repositioned since the heat signatures she'd read 40 minutes ago. Aldrich had moved people. He was restless, or cautious, or both. She reached into her pocket and removed her phone, opened the contact for the specialist she'd designated as internal support, a man named Reyes who had spent 16 years doing close-quarters work in environments where noise was not an option. She typed 2 characters, W2, West Staircase 2. 11 seconds passed. Then the voices stopped. Not abruptly. They tapered, the way conversations taper when attention shifts, and then there was quiet, and the quiet held, and she waited 4 more seconds before she moved forward. At the base of the staircase, 2 men were seated against the wall with the specific stillness of people who had been chemically encouraged toward unconsciousness through a delivery method she had provided to Reyes 3 days ago, and that left no lasting effect and no traceable compound. They looked like men sleeping on a job, which in a different context was exactly what they were. She stepped over the nearest one's legs. Dorian stepped over the other. Graves stayed at the base of the stairs. The main floor opened up above them like the interior of something that had once had purpose and been hollowed out and repurposed without affection. The structural steel columns were original, massive, running floor to ceiling at 12-foot intervals. The catwalks above were new construction, running the perimeter and connecting to the upper-level rooms where the communications center sat. The light was overhead industrial, yellow-white, casting the kind of shadows that had hard edges. The terminal was where the schematic said it would be. A freestanding unit in the center of the floor, roughly the dimensions of a podium, matte black, with a biometric panel on its face and a status indicator currently showing amber, standby, waiting, patient. Between her and the terminal, 8 people that she could see, positioned in a loose perimeter, all armed, all facing outward toward the main access points because that was the direction the threat was supposed to come from. None of them were facing the west staircase column. She looked at Dorian. In the low light, she could see the line of his jaw, the set of his eyes. He looked back at her, and she read in his face the same thing she felt in her chest. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move in spite of it, which was the only definition of courage that had ever made sense to her. She moved. 40 feet across an open floor between structural columns, stepping with the specific weight distribution that minimized sound on concrete, and the first 20 feet were clean, and then one of the perimeter guards turned, not toward her, a routine scan, a professional habit, and she stopped behind a column with her back flat against the steel, and felt Dorian stop behind her, his breath warm against the back of her neck. 3 seconds. The guard completed his scan and faced east again. She moved. The remaining 20 feet happened fast, the way the last distance always happens when you've committed. Not fast like rushing, fast like falling forward and trusting the landing. She reached the terminal and placed both hands on the biometric panel, and the amber light shifted immediately, recognizing the handprint, and then the retinal scanner extended on a mechanical arm, and she held herself still and let it read her, and then the vocal prompt activated. A single low tone, the system's request for the authorization code. She had been holding the code in her mind for 48 hours. She spoke it. 16 characters, a sequence that had no mnemonic structure, no pattern, nothing that could be derived from anything known about her. Pure generation, memorized in one sitting 18 years ago and held without writing it down for every day since. The terminal's status indicator shifted from amber to green, and then a voice behind her said, "Well done." She had known he would be there. She had known it the way you know the shape of a room you've stood in before, by the specific quality of the air. Aldrich Morrow had not been in the heat signature count because Aldrich Morrow had been in a room below the thermal sensor's range, a subfloor space she had known existed and had gambled he would use, because it was the position of maximum control, and Aldrich always chose the position of maximum control. She turned around. He was older than the last image she had of him. Not diminished. Men like Aldrich didn't diminish. They condensed, the way certain materials become denser under pressure. He was 64, and he wore it the way the building wore its industrial bones, without apology. His hair was gray, and his face was her father's face, rearranged by different choices, and she had been preparing herself to see it, and the preparation was insufficient. He had 4 people with him, all armed, all positioned. The perimeter guards had turned inward now. The floor was contained. Dorian was 6 feet to her left, very still. "Seraphine," Aldrich said. The warmth in his voice was the same warmth that had been in the phone call, the warmth of a man who considered himself reasonable. "You built something extraordinary. I want you to know I mean that with complete sincerity." He looked at the terminal. "And you've just given me access to all of it, which is also what I expected." "Is it?" she said. "You're a practical woman. You always were. Your father was a romantic. He believed in principles above outcomes. You were always more like me." He tilted his head slightly, "Which is why I knew, eventually, you would understand that this was always going to happen. I waited because I respected what you were building. I needed it complete." "You waited," she said, "because you couldn't find the third input." He smiled. It was the smile of a man conceding a minor point in a game he believes he's already won. 18 years is a long time to carry a code in your head. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him for a moment. Her father's brother, the man who had sat across a dinner table from her parents and eaten their food and spoken about loyalty while already deciding what they were worth to him. She had imagined this moment in the abstract many times, what she would feel, whether there would be anything that resembled grief or an anger, or the particular shape of feeling that belongs to the specific betrayal of family. What she felt was clarity. "The authorization is complete," she said. "The accounts are open." "Yes." "You should start verification immediately," she said. "I'd recommend your fastest people. You'll want to know what you have as quickly as possible." Something in his expression shifted. Not much. A small tightening, the micro-expression of a man whose pattern recognition has flagged something he can't yet identify. "Why?" he said. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed her phone. She held it so he could see the screen. On it was a timer, counting down, and the number currently showing was 5 hours, 41 minutes. And she watched his eyes go to it, and she watched him read it, and she watched the tightening in his face become something more substantial. "Because that's how long you have before the dissolution sequence completes," she said. "And because in approximately 4 minutes, Every intelligence file I have on the Obsidian Circle's North American operations is going to be transmitted simultaneously to 6 federal agencies and 11 news organizations through a channel you have never seen and cannot stop." She paused. "And because the accounts you just unlocked are a replica. The real assets have been beyond anyone's reach for 4 years." She kept her voice level. "You sacrificed everything for an architecture that no longer exists." The room was very still. Aldrich looked at her. The warmth was gone from his face now. What was underneath it was colder and older and more honest, and she held his gaze the same way she had held everything in her life that was difficult, directly, without flinching, with the full weight of having decided. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. "Since the day I left," she said. "The same way you did." His hand moved, and Dorian moved faster. 15 years of criminal instinct and the specific muscle memory of a man who has survived by being first. He crossed the 6 feet between himself and the nearest armed guard in a movement that was too fast and too direct to be processed before it was complete, and the guard's weapon was redirected before the trigger was reached, and the sound of it clattering on the concrete floor was the signal that broke the room open. Reyes and 2 others came through the eastern access simultaneously. Graves came up the west staircase. The perimeter guards found themselves caught between internal and external pressure with no clear line of fire that didn't risk their own people, which was exactly the tactical geometry she had designed for. 41 people, and not one of them had a clean shot. Aldrich moved toward the terminal. She was already there. She placed her hand on the panel a second time and spoke 2 words that were not part of any authorization sequence Aldrich had ever seen. Words that activated a secondary command she had embedded in the system 8 years ago, dormant and waiting, a command that did one thing and one thing only. It locked him out, permanently, irrevocably. Every access point, every credential, every pathway into the financial architecture, closed in a single irreversible sequence with no recovery protocol and no administrative override, because she had built it that way specifically on the night she had sat alone in this building 7 years ago and understood that the only door worth building was the one that only closed from the inside. Aldrich reached her, his hand closed on her arm. She looked at him. "It's done," she said. "It's already done." And somewhere above them, on the communications level of a decommissioned steel foundry, a server completed its transmission sequence and sent everything she had spent 18 years collecting into the world, and the Obsidian Circle's invisible architecture began to come apart at every seam. And Aldrich Morrow stood in the ruin of 60 years of his family's construction, holding the arm of his brother's daughter who had outweighted him, outbuilt him, and outplanned him from a distance he had never been able to close. And in his face, beneath everything else, beneath the fury and the calculation and the cold that had driven him for 4 decades, there was something that looked, just for a moment, like recognition. The recognition of a man who had underestimated the wrong person for the last time. Dorian appeared at her side. His knuckles were cut and his breathing was hard, and he looked at Aldrich with the eyes of a man who has nothing left to prove, and that is the most dangerous kind. He removed Aldrich's hand from Seraphine's arm with a grip that left no room for interpretation. "It's over," Dorian said. Aldrich looked between them. The room was secured. His people were down or contained. The timer on her phone read 5 hours, 38 minutes. He had nothing left to play. The next 40 minutes were the ugliest kind of work. Not cinematic, not clean. The kind of work that happens in industrial light on concrete floors when the plan has executed, and what remains is the human cost of it. Men who need to be secured, injuries that need pressure applied, a perimeter that needs to hold for long enough that the people inside it can breathe. Reyes had taken a blow to his left side that he was managing by not mentioning. She knew because she watched him move, and the way he turned his body away from contact on that side was involuntary, the body protecting itself below the threshold of conscious decision. She caught his eye once, and he looked back at her with the expression of a professional who will discuss it later and not before. 2 of Aldrich's people had been badly hurt in the initial breach. She directed the medical response herself, working from supplies and a kit she had staged in the maintenance corridor 7 years ago and restocked 12 months ago on a routine she kept the same way. She kept the access codes automatically, without drama, because preparation was not heroism, It was just the habit of someone who understood what the future cost of unpreparedness looked like. Dorian worked beside her without being asked. He had a cut above his right eyebrow that was bleeding in the persistent, annoying way of scalp wounds, refusing to clot properly, and he kept pressing his sleeve to it between tasks. He didn't mention it. She handed him a pressure bandage without comment, and he applied it without comment, and they moved on to the next thing. Graves had secured the eastern access and was managing 6 of Aldrich's people who had surrendered without significant resistance once the tactical geometry made resistance clearly pointless. He zip-tied wrists with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done it before, and he did not speak to the men he was securing, and they did not speak to him. And the silence had the specific quality of a situation that everyone present understands has concluded. Aldrich was seated against the central terminal column with his wrists bound and 2 of Reyes's people standing at angles that gave him nowhere to go and nothing to reach. He was not struggling. He was watching. She could feel it across the floor the way you feel weather coming, a pressure, a directional attention, the specific quality of a highly intelligent person processing catastrophic loss in real time and looking for the angle that doesn't exist. She finished applying pressure to the second injured man's arm and stood up and crossed the floor to where Aldrich sat. She crouched down so their eyes were level. He looked at her. In the industrial light, with the warmth stripped entirely from his face, he looked like what he was, a man who had built 60 years of power on a foundation that had just been pulled out from under him in 90 seconds by someone he had raised from a distance as a succession plan and failed to fully understand. "The accounts," he said. His voice was even. She had to credit that. "Empty. Or they will be in approximately 5 hours and 12 minutes. And the files. Already transmitted. There's no retrieval. No delay. The moment I activated the secondary command at the terminal, it triggered the transmission sequence automatically." She paused. 6 agencies, 11 news organizations, and 3 financial intelligence units in jurisdictions where the Circle has been operating without oversight for decades. He breathed in slowly through his nose. "You've been building this for 18 years. "Yes. While living a life you told me you'd chosen over this." "I chose the life," she said. "I also understood what I'd left behind and what it would eventually send after me." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't want to destroy you, Aldrich. I want you to understand that. Destroying you was never the goal. The goal was making it impossible for you to destroy what I'd built. The destruction is a consequence of you refusing to accept that I left." Something moved in his face. Not regret exactly. Something adjacent to it. The expression of a man encountering a truth that recontextualizes a very long period of his life. "Your father," he said, "would have made the same choice you did." She hadn't expected that. She held very still. "He wanted to walk away too," Aldrich said. "Did you know that? Before you were born, he tried twice to build an exit. I stopped him both times because I believed the Circle needed him, because I believed the institution was larger than any individual's desire." He paused. "I was right about the institution and wrong about the cost. I understood that afterward. I have understood it for 30 years. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been living with something heavy for a very long time. "I told myself what I did was necessary, institutional, not personal." He stopped. "It was personal. He was my brother, and I chose the organization over him, and I have carried that every day since." The floor was very quiet. She was aware of Dorian somewhere behind her, aware of Reyes and Graves at the perimeter, aware of the timer on her phone and the sound of the building and the cold that lived in the steel. She was also aware that she was 32 years old the first time she had allowed herself to cry for her parents, and that she was not going to do it in this building in front of this man, and that the thing moving through her chest right now was not forgiveness and was not absolution and was not the clean resolution that stories were supposed to provide. It was something more complicated and less satisfying and more human than any of that. "That doesn't change what you did," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "Or what happens now?" He looked at his bound wrists, then back at her. "No, it doesn't change that either." She stood up. She stood up and walked away from him, and she did not look back, and she did not say anything else to him. And that was the end of that conversation, and the end of 30 years of unfinished business. And it did not feel like triumph, and it did not feel like closure, and it felt exactly like what it was, which was the moment after something very large has broken, and you are standing in the debris deciding what to carry forward and what to leave. The federal response arrived at 11:47. Not dramatically. A convoy of vehicles, or unmarked but readable, the specific profile of federal presence that anyone who had spent time on the edges of law enforcement could identify at a distance. They came from 3 directions, which told her the coordination had been pre-existing, agencies that had been waiting for something actionable on the circle for years and had received everything they needed in a single transmission 2 hours ago. She had made one call 20 minutes earlier to a contact she had held at a specific agency for 9 years, a contact who knew her as Maren Cole and who had agreed 9 years ago to a standing arrangement. She would deliver the circle when she had what she needed, and in exchange, the people she identified as coerced participants rather than principals would be processed accordingly. She had a list. It was specific and it was accurate, and it reflected 18 years of careful distinction between people who had chosen and people who had been born into something they couldn't leave and had done what they had to do to survive. She knew the difference better than anyone. She handed the list to a woman in a dark jacket who arrived in the first vehicle and who took it without ceremony and looked at it and looked at Seraphine and said, "Maren Cole." "Not anymore," Seraphine said. "That name is done." The woman looked at her for a moment. "And the Vescari organization?" "Also done." She held the woman's gaze. "What you have in those transmissions will give you everything you need on the circle. The Vescari structure is being dissolved voluntarily. The legitimate business holdings are documented and clean. I can provide full accounting for the separation of assets. The criminal operations have been inactive for longer than you'll think, because the infrastructure that supported them has been redirecting toward legitimate channels for 4 years. She paused. "I can document all of it. You'll need to come in." "I know." She glanced back at Dorian, who was standing 20 feet away watching this conversation with the expression of a man who is listening to his life being reorganized by someone else and has made peace with that, or is in the process of making peace with it, which is as close as anyone gets. "We both will." The woman followed her glance, looked at Dorian, looked back. "This is going to be a long process." "Yes," Seraphine said. "I know what long processes feel like." What followed was not a single moment, but a series of them, spread across weeks that moved with the particular slowness of legal and institutional process. The kind of time that has no drama in it, only wait. Dorian sat across tables from people in suits and answered questions with the specific discipline of a man who had decided completely and without reservation to tell the truth, which was a discipline she recognized because she had watched him decide it in real time on the floor of that foundry, in the moment after Aldrich had been secured and the federal vehicles were 20 minutes out. He had looked at her and said, "We tell them everything." And she had said, "Yes." And neither of them had elaborated because there was nothing to elaborate. It was the cleanest decision she had ever watched him make. Graves cooperated fully. She had not known if he had understood that a man who had spent 9 years inside a criminal organization had his own calculations to make about what cooperation cost him. But he came in voluntarily 3 days after Harrogate, and he sat down and he talked for a very long time. And what he said was accurate and detailed, and reflected the specific knowledge of someone who had been central to operations while remaining genuinely ignorant of the architecture beneath them, which was a distinction the prosecutors ultimately accepted. He came to find her, 6 weeks later, in the lobby of a building she was using for the separation of asset documentation. He stood in front of her in a coat that looked like it had been worn for a week, and he said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't." "I do. For the way I looked at you in that study, like you'd done something to me." He stopped. "You were protecting something. You were protecting all of us, including people who didn't know they needed it." He paused. "I just wanted you to know I understand that now." She looked at him for a moment. Toussaint Graves, who had been inside a kingdom without knowing who built it, and who had found out the hard way, and who was standing in front of her now with the uncomfortable dignity of a man making an accounting of himself. It wasn't a comfortable way to live, she said. Being what I was and not being able to say it. She paused. I'm sorry for that part. The part that wasn't protection. The part that was just isolation. He nodded. Once. The way he nodded at things that were settled. Then he shook her hand and he left, and she watched him go through the lobby doors and into the street, and that was the last time she saw Toussaint Graves in person, though she heard later that he had taken a job in private security consulting in a city far from anything they'd all been part of, and was apparently good at it, which surprised nobody who had ever watched him work. Aldrich was processed through federal custody and transferred to a jurisdiction that had been waiting for him specifically, with a case file that now contained 18 years of Seraphine's documentation on top of everything the Circle's own records had revealed when the transmission hit. His legal team was formidable, and they made the process long, which she had expected. The outcome was not in question. She had not built the case for 18 years to have it be in question. She did not attend any of the proceedings. She did not need to. She had said everything she needed to say to him on the floor of that foundry, crouching at his eye level in the industrial light. Whatever happened in courtrooms after that was institutional and necessary and not hers to carry. The Viscari name came off the buildings in April. She watched it happen from across the street, standing on a sidewalk in the kind of morning that couldn't decide between winter and spring, the air carrying both at once, sharp and tentative. A maintenance crew on a lift, removing letters from the facade of the building that had been the nominal headquarters of the Viscari organization's legitimate holdings for 11 years. The letters came off one at a time, and the building looked exposed without them, the way buildings do when their signage changes, raw, temporary, in the process of becoming something else. Dorian stood beside her. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was watching the letters come down with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual. She could usually read him now with the specific fluency that comes from 20 years of close attention, plus the last several months of the kind of honesty that strips the protective layering off everything. How does it feel? She said. He thought about it, actually thought, which was one of the things she had always valued in him beneath all the rest of it. He didn't perform his answers. He found them. Like putting down something very heavy, he said, and not being sure yet whether my arms remember what to do without it. She understood that precisely. They do, she said. They remember. It just takes time to feel it. He looked at her. How much time? I don't know. I haven't finished yet either. He turned back to the building. The last letter came off. The facade was bare stone, and it was honestly not bad-looking stone, the kind of material that didn't need ornamentation. The foundation in the Cayman structure, he said, the one that holds the bulk of the asset migration. How long before it resolves into something we can actually access through legitimate channels? 4 years, minimum, possibly 6. And until then, we work, she said. The consulting structure I registered last month is legitimate and properly capitalized, and I have already identified 3 clients who want exactly the kind of financial architecture expertise I can provide without any of the previous context. She paused. It's slower. It pays less. It's also the first income I've ever generated that I can discuss in full daylight. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, small, dry, the laugh of a man who is finding something genuinely funny in a situation that is also genuinely difficult. You know what I realized, he said. What? Every instinct I trusted for 15 years, every decision I made, every room I walked into thinking I was the most prepared person in it. He paused. I was. I was always the most prepared person in the room. I just didn't understand that the preparation was yours. She was quiet for a moment. The decisions were yours, she said. Everyone. I gave you infrastructure. You gave it movement. You understood people in ways I couldn't replicate. The way you could read a room, read a threat, read the specific quality of someone's loyalty before they demonstrated it. She stopped. I built the ground. You built the life on it. Both of those things are real. Neither one cancels the other. He looked at her. It was the look of a man who was deciding whether to accept something, and she watched him decide, and the decision took the form of a slow exhale and a small adjustment in the set of his shoulders, the body releasing something it had been holding. "I'm going to need a while," he said, "to rebuild what I think I know about my own life." "I know. That's going to be uncomfortable." "Yes." "You could have told me," he said. "Not an accusation, just a fact set down carefully. At some point in 15 years, you could have found a way." She looked at the bare stone of the building. "I could have. There were moments when I almost did." She paused. "I told myself it was protection, and it was. But it was also fear. Fear that if you knew who I really was, what I really came from, you would look at the life we'd built and see it differently." She stopped. "See me differently?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you want to know how I see you?" "Yes." He turned to face her fully, which he didn't always do when he said important things. Dorian was a man who sometimes said the most significant things while looking at something else, a habit she'd catalogued years ago as the tell of someone who felt exposure most acutely in the direct moments. But he turned to face her. "I see a woman who built something enormous out of something terrible," he said, "who took the worst possible origin and made it into a shield instead of a wound, who has been doing the hardest work, alone, for the longest time, and who finally let someone stand next to her." He paused. "I'm still angry. I want you to know that. The anger isn't gone. But it's not at you. It's at the situation, at the years, at the version of this that couldn't have been different because of what we were both carrying." He stopped. "But when I see you, I see you. Not the secrets. You." She was very still. There was something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Not happiness exactly, though it contained something of that. More like the feeling of a weight being redistributed. Not removed, just carried differently, by more than one person, which was both simpler and more frightening than carrying it alone. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know. I'm going to keep making unilateral decisions when I think the situation requires it. I'm built that way. It's going to make you angry. Probably. And I'm going to have to learn to tell you things before they become crises, which means trusting the outcome instead of controlling it, which is," she paused, "not natural to me." "I know that too." He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it and held it, the way people hold things they intend to keep. "We'll figure out the new shape of it." She looked at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked back at the building. The maintenance crew had packed up their lift and were moving down the street. The stone facade caught the morning light without apology. Just what it was, just material waiting to become whatever came next. 3 weeks later, she registered the name of a private financial consulting firm with an address in a city that was not the city they had operated in before. She used her real name. Not Vale, not Cole, not Morrow as the world had known it. Seraphine Viscari. She had thought about it for some time. The choice of name was the choice of what to claim. She was not her grandfather's succession plan. She was not her uncle's unfinished business. She was not the woman who had hidden for 20 years, or the woman who had built in secret, or the woman who had carried everything alone because she believed that was the only way to carry it safely. She was the woman who had finally put it all on the table, in a kitchen in October, and then in a printing facility, and a storage unit, and a decommissioned foundry, and who had come out the other side of it with less than she'd gone in with, and more than she'd ever allowed herself to want. Dorian saw the registration documents on her desk one morning and stood there reading them without touching them, and then he looked at her across the room and said, "Viscari." "Yes." "You could have taken something new, built a completely clean name." "I could have," she said. "I've built enough clean names. I wanted one that was actually mine." He looked at the documents for another moment. Then he went to make coffee, and she heard him in the kitchen, and the sound of it was ordinary and specific and present. The sound of a life that was being lived in the same room as another life, which was not a small thing and never had been. What they had built before had been vast and intricate and rested on a foundation of secrets and the specific strength of a woman who had decided at the age of 22 that she would protect everything she loved by controlling everything around it. What they were building now was smaller and slower and visible in full daylight and built by both of them together, which meant it was less perfect and more real. And it was theirs in a way that the Empire had never fully been, because the Empire had always carried within it the shape of everything she had hidden, the weight of the unsaid and the unseen and the unclaimed. This was just their life, imperfect, accountable, fully lit. On the day the consulting firm opened its first office, she arrived early and stood alone in the empty space for a few minutes before the furniture arrived. It was a modest room, clean lines, good light from the north-facing windows, a view of a street that was just a street, people moving through their mornings without awareness of anything that had happened in the months before. She stood in the center of the room. She was not thinking about the Obsidian Circle, which was currently working its way through 7 separate federal proceedings across 4 jurisdictions. She was not thinking about Aldrich, who had stopped being her responsibility the moment she stood up from the floor of that foundry and walked away. She was not thinking about the empire that had carried her husband's name and her invisible architecture for 15 years and was now being systematically dissolved into clean forms and legitimate structures that would take years to fully settle. She was thinking about a kitchen, October light, a photograph turned face down on a table, the specific feeling of the moment before something changes irrevocably, when you are standing on the near side of it and can still feel the shape of what you've been carrying and know that the carrying is nearly done. She had built kingdoms. She had built them in secret and in darkness, and with the specific loneliness of someone who cannot share the weight of what they're doing because sharing it would destroy the thing itself. She had built infrastructure and networks and contingencies within contingencies. She had built a future out of the wreckage of an origin she hadn't chosen and a history she hadn't been able to outrun, only outlast. The room was quiet and full of morning light and absolutely ordinary. She thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever built. The door opened behind her. Dorian came in carrying 2 coffees from the place on the corner, the same brand they'd had at home for 15 years because she bought it automatically, and he had never mentioned preferring anything else. He handed her one. He looked around the room. "Small," he said. "Yes. We'll need more space eventually." "Eventually," she said. "Not yet." He stood beside her and looked at the empty room and the north light and the ordinary street below, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the quiet between them was the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that has been earned over a very long time and a very difficult distance, the kind that means something is, finally, at rest. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The city moved outside the window, indifferent and continuous, the way cities do. And the most powerful empire either of them had ever known, built from blood and shadow and the extraordinary will of a woman who had refused to be what she was born into and refused to let go of what she loved, dissolved quietly into the ordinary texture of a life, lived fully, in the light, by 2 people who had finally learned to carry it together.